In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Finding the will of God. One of the most dramatic stories of a ministry calling is in the Bible, where Saul of Tarsus was on his way to persecute the church somewhere, and he heard a voice, saw a light. God spoke to him, and he testified later, standing before King Agrippa. He says, "Therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision." And that vision was his calling into ministry. Often it's not that dramatic. Wouldn't it be great if God always showed us His will that clearly and that easily? Wouldn't that be great? And I've had decisions sometimes in my life when I thought, oh, Lord, this is so important. I've got to know what you want me to do. You've got to show me, because this is too important for me to just decide it on my own. And sometimes God did not speak like I wanted Him to. It wasn't like I just got this clear sign, this clear voice. And I've tried doing these different signs, like, Lord, if you want me to do this, let this happen, or whatever, kind of like Gideon did. You remember he put in the towel outside and said, if I'm supposed to do this, let it be wet and the ground dry, and then he tries it the other way and all this stuff. That stuff never worked for me. I've heard people talk about signs that they've gotten. The Lord has not led me that much that way. And so for those of us who may be a little more average when it comes to trying to figure out what the will of God is, I want to talk about some examples and tell you some stories today. I was born in a pastor's home and grew up. My dad pastored several different places as I was growing up. And one of the things that was strongly emphasized in our home, and I don't know that they said it, I got it, was that you follow God's will wherever it leads. And if you want to write down any points today, I'm going to tell you this is going to be mostly some stories, but I will give you a few points along the way if you want them. And that's the first one, to follow God's will wherever it leads. Because my dad, he pastored small churches, and whenever he felt like God was leading him to another place, he would go. And it didn't matter how much they were going to pay. It didn't matter how big it was. You follow God's will wherever it leads. And so I just grew up with this consciousness that wherever God wants me to go, I'm going to go. I'm not going to think about how I want to stay in a certain area or where there's, people pay more or anything like that. I'm going to go where God leads me. And then a second one was trusting God to provide. Trust God to provide. And we went places. I remember his salary at one church was $35 a week for a while. And most of the time, my dad tried to devote himself to the ministry and not do other work. He did some things along the way, but for the most part, he wanted to be devoted to the ministry. And so we lived sacrificially. Now, and that's the third point, live sacrificially. Now, I didn't grow up thinking I was poor. When we were young and at Christmas time, my parents they bought a pile of gifts at Christmas time, and we never went hungry. I never knew we were poor, but I guess we were. We lived sacrificially. We didn't have a lot of extra, but God provided. And He really did provide. We didn't grow up feeling like, oh, wish we could do something else. Wish Dad could get paid more. Something like that. We knew we were in the will of God and that He was providing and that He was taking care of us. And from a fairly early age, I began to get the sense that I was going to be in ministry. I just began to feel just kind of this consciousness that God wanted me to be in ministry. I didn't tell anybody for a long time. And it wasn't really definite in my mind, but I just had this consciousness. And so now there's a reason why I didn't tell anybody. I'm an introvert, by the way. You might not think that an introvert can stand up here and speak to a crowd, but a lot of us do. And so I was too extreme. Now, I don't know who the shyest, and an introvert's not necessarily shy. That's not necessarily the same thing, but I was. And I don't know who the shyest person would be here today. You don't have to raise your hand. But I can tell you I was probably worse. Now, and for those of you who have never been shy, you cannot understand how agonizing it is to be shy. You just don't have a clue. But to when we would go to visit somebody, I would hope that they did not have kids my age, because I didn't want to have to try to relate to kids my age. I didn't know how, didn't want to. I'd rather just sit in the living room and be quiet, listen to the adults talk. Now that tells you right there I was strange, right? And as I got, now when I was real young, I was kind of a boisterous young boy. In fact, first girl that I had somebody ask her if she would like me, she said she would like me more if I was more quiet. Well, no chance, there's no chance of that. I dismissed her with that. But nobody ever said that later. I was the quietest person around. And I mean, I was so self-conscious and shy that if I met somebody and greeted them and said hi, and then went on, I would wonder if my voice sounded right when I said it. Was it too loud? Did I squeak? Did I make the right, did I just look normal? That is how self-conscious I was. I mean, the way where I would sit and the way I would walk and the way, it was a painful self-consciousness. Okay, so then you put that with a person who feels called to ministry, okay? Now, some guys and women that people just know from the time that they're young they're going to go in ministry. Oh, you can tell he's going to be a preacher, right? I mean, nobody ever said that about me. Nobody ever said that. In fact, even my own relatives, especially my own relatives, when they heard, they said, "Really? He's going to be a preacher?" Because they had almost never heard me talk, At family reunions, we'd have these big family reunions, and on my mom's side, they were Palmers, they were all Nazarenes, and most of the men were preachers. But they would get together, and my cousins were mostly girls, a little older than me. They were all loud, and I would take books with me to the family reunion. And I would go find a quiet corner somewhere and read at the family reunion. While the kids were playing pit or other loud things, I'd go read a book. And so that's just how they knew me. So you can imagine when they heard that I said I was going to be a preacher. My mom, I think, was the only one that wasn't surprised, maybe. She had felt like God had told her that I would be a preacher, but she never told me. Now, this is interesting because she wanted my call to come from God. She did not want me to be confused in seeking the will of God because my mom told me I was supposed to be a preacher. It's interesting, isn't it? And I've known of kids that kind of grew up under a disadvantage where their parents kind of imposed this expectation on them too early, and it made it confusing for them trying to seek the will of God. And so if that has happened to you, it might be a little harder for you to pray through and be clear, but as much as possible, you've got to try to get past that. Now, finally, I remember the time I was about to graduate from high school, and I graduated early. And I'll just tell you, this is part of my story. I graduated 3 years early from high school. I was going to ACE. My mom made me work hard. It was her fault mostly. She would study with me and review and review and review till we would beg to stop. But I made good grades because of that, and I graduated early. And then she said I was too young to go to college, and so I had to do a year's worth at home. I did more stuff at home, a year's worth of college. Well, then once that was up, they said, okay, well, maybe you're old enough to go now. And so I had to decide what I was going to do. I had to basically admit. And I remember, because, if you're going to go to college, you got to know what you're going to do, right? To some extent. Or at least to know whether you ought to go to Bible college. So I remember one night, my dad was pastoring there in Marshall, Illinois. And my bedroom was in this kind of a loft room. And I remember getting on my knees that night and praying, and I said something like this: Lord, I've got to know for sure if I'm supposed to preach. Because, I was down to this timeline, And so, am I supposed to preach? And I felt a confirmation just as clear as it could absolutely be. Didn't hear a voice, but it was just as clear as if I had. I just knew. It was like God said, yes, you are. I never doubted it from then on. And so God can make His will known. There was no vision, no sounding bells, anything like that, like some people have had. But I knew. I had a certainty. And so then I had to decide, okay, when am I going to tell them? And I put it off for a little while. I had a little bit of time before we had to say, that I was going to go to Bible college. And so The reason I didn't want to tell them was I'd heard my dad talk about when he got his call to preach. He was 12 years old, and his dad was a pastor, my grandpa. And so my dad told his dad that he had a call to preach, and his dad said, "Okay, great. Can you preach next Sunday?" And he did. Well, I was afraid he'd do the same thing to me, so I didn't want to tell him, even though I was older than 12 years old. But finally I did. I finally told him, "I've got a call to preach." And he didn't actually do it that suddenly. It was a few weeks later when he asked me to preach. And so I prepared for my first message. And that was the biggest challenge that I'd ever had. Now, I had made a graduation speech when I graduated from high school, and I was young, but and my speech was memorized. My mom found it for me. I didn't write a speech. These people that write these speeches and talk about everybody they appreciate and everything. I didn't write anything. I just got this little speech about how it is the commencement, the beginning of a new, stage of life and all that kind of thing. About a 3-minute thing. And I memorized that till I could have said it in my dream because I knew that I was going to be so scared when I got up there. I don't know why she didn't just let me read it. Why couldn't I just read it? What would be wrong with that? But she didn't let me read it. I don't know why. I had to memorize it. And so I got up there with nothing to go by, but I had it down. I memorized, I quoted that out, and probably stammered a couple times, but I had it. That was the first thing, that was the biggest challenge of public speaking I had ever made. And so then to come up with your own message, hopefully from God and from the Scripture, but where you're deciding what you're going to say and to get up there and speak to about 15 people in that little church. And so I remember I preached about prayer. I still remember some of the things I said in that message. And it was about everything I knew about prayer that I thought was important. And I remember sitting there, and on the wall, there was this verse that says, "He it is that doth go with thee." And then another verse on the other side. And I still remember seeing that one and sitting there and trying to encourage myself with that verse before I got up to preach. And I got up and I preached for 7 minutes. Everything I could think of to say that was worthwhile to say about prayer, I preached in 7 minutes. And but you know what? Preaching was never as hard after that. It was never as hard after that. I kind of passed the difficult point. And by the way, I didn't even consider saying no. And you know what? This is another point. If you want to write things down, don't consider saying no to the role of ministry that God has called you to. And it didn't, because I knew that God wanted me to preach. It didn't even occur to me. It didn't even occur to me that when my dad said, "I want you to preach next Sunday," that I could say, "Well, I don't feel ready. I don't really want to. I don't think I want to." It didn't even enter my mind. You're called to preach. Somebody asks you to preach, you preach. And that was what I always thought. For my whole ministry, I've just assumed. Now I know sometimes you have to choose between one thing and another, what you're going to do. But if you're called to do it, you do it. And so I went to Union Bible College. I didn't really pray about it much. My sister had gone there a little while. It's the only one I was really familiar with, and so I didn't even think about it much. That's just where I thought I was supposed to go, and it was a great time there. Some of the emphasis that I picked up there was that your relationship with God is the first priority. I remember that being emphasized, which I knew that, but I was just conscious of that there. That everything would stop if somebody needed to pray. Everything would stop if there was revival time and God was moving. Everything else could be paused, and that was an emphasis that was through there, and I really appreciate that. And then another thing that I felt was emphasized there was that keeping your focus on ministry through all of your decisions, who you marry, what kind of job you're going to get, wherever you're going to go, keeping that focus on ministry. Do not do anything that's going to take you away from fulfilling the plan of God for your life. Now, when I went to Bible college, I had only preached that one time, my 7-minute message on prayer. That was the only time I had preached. And so when I got there, I found here's all these other guys that they've already preached a bunch. They've preached a lot of times. And there were some, that came and they were 18 years old or 19 years old. There were others that were already in their mid-20s or so, and maybe they got saved a little later or whatever, but they'd preached and they were just excited about preaching and ready to preach any chance they got. Well, I still didn't feel like a real preacher. I'd preached one time, 7 minutes long. And so I remember one, it made me nervous, and it made me feel like I wasn't really the real thing. And you're going to feel that way sometimes. And I want to encourage you, in case you feel that way already, that's kind of inevitable that you're going to feel that way sometimes. And I remember once in chapel, they announced one day, sometimes churches call us and they have a pastor gone or sick or whatever, and they need a preacher to come and preach. And so we'd like for the preacher guys to come over here to the side after chapel and sign up. Give us your name and phone number if you are willing to be available to preach if somebody calls in needing a preacher. And so after the service, here all these guys gather over there, and here's 15 or 20 young preacher guys. And I knew I needed to do that. I thought, okay, I've got to do that. But I went so reluctantly and nervously. Thought, if somebody calls in here wanting somebody to go preach, I'm not ready. What if they even wanted both services on a Sunday or something like that? But I went, I signed up. They never sent me anywhere from that list. But there was, a few months in, we did get a call, and I'm not sure exactly how it happened. I think they must have been scraping the bottom of the barrel, and I was the only one around. It might have even been during school break or something. But over the Wesleyan Church over at Summitville, Indiana, needed somebody to come over and preach on a Wednesday night. And so I went with a couple of the college girls that drove me over because I wasn't allowed to have my car at school yet because I was too young. And I got a car and had it all polished up and ready to take to. I was excited about that, but you couldn't have one on campus until you were over 18. I thought they ought to make an exception, but they didn't. And so So I go over there to preach, and I preached on the life of Samson. And I preached for 15 minutes, more than double my first message. I preached for 15 minutes on the life of Samson. And it wasn't great. I didn't think it was terrible. But I felt like I had really accomplished something just to do it, And an older lady came up to me after the service. And, one thing that was kind of bothered me a little bit was one of the students at the college was from that church. And he was one of these real outgoing, expressive guys, and I knew they'd heard him preach. And so, I knew mine was going to be nothing like that. And this older lady came up to me after the service. She said, "Son, how old are you?" And I said, 16. And she said, "Well, you're not doing too bad then." And so she was trying to encourage me. And I don't know if it did. I don't guess it really did. But anyway, that was my second round. And that was, again, the first one was a big step. The second one was another big step. And after that, I was never as scared to preach again as what I had been those times. In fact, I began to look forward to it. It's like, okay, the worst is past. I had tried it. I survived it. And I began to look forward to preaching. And so, you know what? Just a principle here. At your stage of life, you don't really know what your talents are. You probably know some. But to a great extent, you don't know what your talents are, and some of them may never surface if you don't try some things, okay? And so especially if the door is open and something is needed and you are available, respond and try because you really don't know what all God might want to develop in you. And there are things that really don't show up. Nobody would have picked me at that stage as a public speaker. In fact, I remember one of the students talking to me and kind of getting on to me, for not having more interest in ministry and pointing out some of the others. He says, so-and-so and so-and-so, they're going to go out and they're going to do great things for God. They're going to go do great things in ministry. Why don't you be more like that, And so it doesn't always show up at that stage. I remember at that time, I had a dream one night. And I dreamed that I was walking down a street and in a little town, and I came alongside this old white church that looked like it had not been open for a long time. Paint was peeling, the sign was in bad shape, steps were cracked, weeds growing up. And I thought, I'd like to just see what it looks like inside. And I walked up to the door, and remember, I'm dreaming all this, okay? And I walk up there, and I try the knob, and it's unlocked. I thought, wow, this is interesting. And so I just thought, well, let's see what it looks like inside. And so I walked in, and I suddenly got this shock. There were some people sitting motionless in the pews. It's like, whoa. And I sit here, and at first I thought they were dead. you know. And then one of the heads slowly turns to look at me. And I realize they're in service. This church is not closed. This is an active church, and they're actually in service. And I went out. I fled the scene, you know. And I woke up. And I was troubled, disturbed by that dream, because I was like, man, how bad a shape does a church have to get in that somebody would think it's closed? I mean, and here it's still open, and everybody around wouldn't even know. And here are these people in there, you know, nearly, you can hardly tell that they're alive. And you know, that haunted me for some time, and I determined I am never going to just settle for routine in my ministry. I'm never going to just open at a certain time and close at a certain time and feel like it doesn't matter whether I'm succeeding or not. I've got some excuse for failing. You know, it's better to succeed than to have an excuse for failing. Did you know that? But a lot of people have just been satisfied to have an excuse. And there have been so many pastors that they'll pastor a church for years as it slowly declines under their leadership, and then finally resign and leave just before it gasps its last and closes. And, you know, I determined I am never going to do that. I am never going to have a church that I am satisfied to have it like that and leave it like that. Don't settle for the routine. I never considered quitting college. And I want to tell you this, give you this point. Don't shortcut your training. Don't shortcut your training. In fact, if you put with that, invest early. You know, the earlier you study, the easier it's going to be. And when I hear people say, well, I decided to take a few years off, or I decided to take a year off, I don't understand that at all, because it never gets any easier. Your circumstances never get any easier. I'm not saying it never worked for anybody. I guess it has. But the earlier you invest in your training, the better off you will be. It will never be easier to get it than what it is now. And I knew if God's called me to preach, I need to be as trained as I can be. I need to know as much as I can know going into that. And whether it was from discouragement or from zeal. Like some people say, oh, I need to get out there. I'm ready to get started. What's the use of reading all these books? Let's get out there and get people saved. That's a good motive, I guess, but usually misguided. And so I just knew that I needed to finish. I worked on the work program. And I had the most boring jobs on campus. At that time, they had the boys' dorms were like these big houses. And so they had guys clean them because they didn't want girls going into these boys' dorms. And so I got that job for a while. And that was a pretty miserable job. I cleaned and I worked. I also got some outside work. I worked at McDonald's for a while. And I did office cleaning. For an office cleaning company, and made pretty good money at that. We would go in. There should be like a desk and a trash can and so on. So we'd go in and dust off the desk. The coffee cups. If there was a coffee cup sitting there, it took too long to take it and dump it out in a sink somewhere and wash it. So what we would do is we dump it in the trash and squirt Windex or dust spray into it and wipe it out and put it back on the desk. And so I don't know if anybody ever realized that their coffee was tasting a little more like dust spray. It was clean. It was clean. Just hadn't been cleaned with water and soap. It was cleaned with dust spray. But I got fast. I learned it. I got to where every motion was next, and I was doing them. They got to where they were paying me by the job instead of by the hour. And so I was making about double per hour what they had been paying. And so I enjoyed that. But man, there was one place I cleaned that it was this kind of spooky. It was dark in there. It had all these individual little offices that you'd go in and clean, and it was creaky and this old wooden paneling. And I hated working there. I just always felt like somebody was behind me. And then the last thing we would do is late at night, and it's just me by myself there, take the trash out to the dumpster. And I remember one night I went out there with the bags of trash, and I was already nervous, in the dark and back this parking lot. And just as I'm getting ready to throw the bags in, I hear all this a scrambling sound inside the dumpster. And so I'm just kind of paralyzed for a second, and then this cat jumped out. But but you know what? I think a person should be willing to do what it takes, and don't consider any work beneath you. That's a good point. Don't consider any work beneath you. Whether it's mopping floors, do whatever it takes, and that will serve you well when you're in the ministry too, because it doesn't matter if you're the pastor or the president of something, you may have to do some mopping. You may have to carry some trash. Do what it takes to get the job done, and don't consider any work beneath you. I met the girl that I would marry there. That was the best thing I got from Bible college. And we were, during our senior year, trying to decide where we were going to go because we were planning on getting married. And so I tried out at a little church down in Kentucky. And we drove down there, had to take another girl with us since we weren't married yet, so an extra person in the car. So we drove down there, and I preached morning and night at this little church. And they had a young fella, a 16-year-old young man that was in the church. They didn't have a pastor, but he had been preaching, filling in, and they said he was doing a great job. And after they heard me preach, they decided that they'd be better off just to stay with him for the time. And so they didn't call me to preach there. And I know now it wasn't God's will to do that. And actually I've told her this story. The King girl is not here, is she? It was Candy King's dad, Chris King, was the 16-year-old. Not Candy. Candy is his wife. Chris and Candy. I don't remember the first name of the King girl. She's a student here. You know who I'm talking about, right? Pardon? Juliana. Yeah. Okay, I remember that now. Juliana. Her dad was Chris, and he was the 16-year-old boy that was doing a great job preaching already at that time. So we got married, and we graduated on a Saturday and got married the next Saturday. Now, I think now of all the work that supposedly goes into getting ready for a wedding, and I was pretty much unaware of that, I guess. Obviously, it wasn't done by me. And here we are, we finished this, school year, everything that's involved in your last year of schooling, and got married the next week. Now, here's the interesting thing, though. I didn't have a job, and we didn't have a place to live. And so we got married without knowing where we were going to live. Isn't that cool? I don't recommend that. I'm not saying do that. That was just part of the adventure. And looking back on that, I don't know what in the world I was thinking. But I just was assuming God's going to lead, we're going to be okay. And, trusting God doesn't mean you should be careless, doesn't mean you should not plan, doesn't mean you should be reckless. So I'm not saying that that's a sign of trusting God. But it was for me, I guess. And I had tried out at the one church, and we looked into some other things, and nothing had definitely worked out at that point. And so we got married and went on our honeymoon. We went to Branson, Missouri. And the only money we had was mostly what we had been given as gifts at our wedding. We had this handful of cash, wedding gifts. And we go down there and have our honeymoon. And then we went to Pilgrim camp. And there, Don Nichols, who pastors at Lima, still pastors at Lima, approached me and asked me if we would come to their school and teach, both of us. And we did. And so the Lord took care of us. We went there. Went there for a year. From there, we went down to seminary at Wesley Biblical Seminary. And, I learned about culture a little bit along the way because when I lived in Mississippi, the culture was definitely different. And it was kind of a culture shock for them, too. I worked in this little school, and these doors just opened. I was renting in this little duplex, and I didn't understand Mississippi culture. But the South is definitely different. Anybody from that far south? Anybody from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia? Nobody? But I worked in this little school, and there was this woman that worked there named Sister Patterson. And she told us toward the end of the first year, she said, I've never been up north much, but after getting to know you guys, I don't think I'd want to live up there. And so I knew that we had not adapted real well. We had not given a good impression of the Yankees. And I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry that worked out that way. But we taught there for a while. We taught in Oklahoma for a while. I went back to teach at UBC and worked on my doctorate up in northern Indiana at Grace Theological Seminary. They were 5-point Calvinists. So they believe that God has decided before anybody is born, whether they're going to be saved or not, and whether He's going to give them the grace they need to be saved. And it was fascinating. It was kind of depressing, a lot of it, but it was interesting. I wasn't mostly taking theology classes; it was ministry classes. But I was so thankful that I had a Wesleyan master's degree and a Wesleyan Bible college degree, because and let me encourage you. And you may be getting. And I know some of you are high school, but here Your theology is probably going to be better than what I was getting back then. But if you're going to get a master's degree, don't go to a Calvinist place to get your master's degree. Go to a Wesleyan, a good Holiness Wesleyan place, because it's not just that if you go to a Calvinist place, you've got to be on guard all the time, but there's all this that you're going to miss. I mean, there is this wealth of holiness theology that you won't get if you don't go to a place that has it. And so, sure, I went to if you go on to get other kind of degrees for professional things, doctorates or whatever, wherever you think is best to go, go. But on graduate level for your master's degree, don't go to this is my opinion, this is my belief, don't go to a Calvinist place for that. While we were teaching there at Union Bible College, Melvin Adams came through. And Melvin was working in Ukraine. He was missionary in Ukraine at the time. And he came through and he visited Mark Bird, who is now Dr. Bird at GBS, but at that time he was working with me at Union Bible College. And he said, hey, you ought to come over and teach a class. And then later he sent him a message, why don't you and Steve come over and teach a class? That was so, I got this very secondhand invitation, kind of tacked on there. And so Mark and we talked about it a lot, and I was teaching a bunch of classes at UBC. I had become the principal, kind of filling in for the coming year, but I was taking a lot of, anyway, I had a lot of work to do. I was working at a restaurant part-time to support myself because Bible colleges back then didn't pay like they pay now. And I thought I'd get some reaction from teachers, but anyway, and I had a big family. But and I just really thought about it, and I thought, okay, it would be crazy to do that. I shouldn't do it. And so I told Stephanie, I said, they invited us to do this, but I probably shouldn't do it, right? And I thought she would right away say, oh, no, you shouldn't do it. We can't afford that. I was going to buy my own ticket. It was going to cost about $1,000 to buy my own ticket and go over there, take 2 weeks off. The school would let me go, but I'd also, lose the other work. I thought she would instantly say, no, you shouldn't do it. But she said, I think you better pray about it. Well, that surprised me that she was even open to me praying about it. And so I thought, well, and really as I thought about it, I hadn't prayed about it much, or maybe none. And so I thought, okay, well, I ought to pray about it. And so at least get that done. So the next morning, as I was having my devotions, and I was sitting there in the living room, and I remember, I'd gotten up early, and my kids were still asleep, and I was sitting there, and I was praying about it, and I thought of it. Okay, yeah, here's this. I need to get this done. Lord, I've got this invitation to go to Ukraine, but with all these classes I'm teaching and everything and the money and all that, I probably shouldn't do it right now, right? And I kind of just waited for this, kind of like, yeah, you shouldn't do it. But I didn't hear anything. Now, I'm not saying I expect to hear things from God all the time, every time I ask a question. I don't. But I was expecting to just kind of feel this, feel comfortable dismissing this option. You know what I mean? Just, okay, I prayed about it. Don't think I should go. It's done. But as I paused, I didn't feel that confirmation. I said, I shouldn't go, right, Lord? Still nothing. And so I kind of went on for the day, but knowing, feeling like, okay, well, that question's not really answered. And so I prayed about it again the next morning. Okay, Lord, about Ukraine, I got to tell them. And I just began to feel like maybe I should go. And that feeling began to increase. And so I bought the ticket on my credit card, and that's not a principle to write down, to buy things on your credit card. But I bought the ticket on my credit card and went in. Daniel Lee was the academic dean at that time. We gave him our notice that we were going to be making this trip. They agreed to let us be gone for the 2 weeks. And Mark Bird and I flew to Ukraine. And we stayed in an apartment in town. And we got there on a Friday night. Saturday we went out, worked on the grounds where they were trying to develop a new campus. Sunday we were in service. And Monday I taught my first class. And by Monday night, I was just consumed with this desire to go live in Ukraine. And I didn't know whether I was called or not, but I was really hoping I would be. And I wanted to go work in Ukraine more than anything I had ever thought of. And it was Sunday night, actually. I remember that I was because Melvin was actually flying out the next morning. And I got up the next day because I wanted to go talk to him, and I didn't get to because they were already gone. And so I was wanting kind of a confirmation, but I think the Lord didn't want it to happen that way. He wanted me to work through the process a little more. And so as I was praying about it, and it was interesting, Dr. Bird, Mark, he wasn't a doctor back then, but Mark Bird, he was interested. He liked the ministry there. In fact, he over the next few years, made repeated trips back to teach there, but he wasn't feeling what I was feeling at all. The idea of going there, to live there and do that ministry, didn't occur to him at all. He had no interest in that. It was just me. And so I started writing to Stephanie and trying to talk about how exciting the ministry was there. I thought, if I just say I think I'm called there, she's going to be shocked and horrified and resist it. So I'm going to try to build up and tell her how, get her to understand how great it is. Well, within about the third email, she already figured out where I was heading with it, which surprised me. And so then we talked about it, and she was resistant. And so I thought, okay, I better not talk about it much till we get home. So I got home. And she told me later that the Lord, and it's a long story, can't tell you all about it, but the Lord had already spoken to her previous to that time and told her that we were going to be called to Ukraine. And she never told me. In fact, as I was getting ready to go out the door to go to the airport, she said, you think you'll come back with a call to Ukraine? I said, no way. If I ever was going to go to a mission field, it wouldn't be Ukraine. I mean, I have no interest in that kind of place. A mission field ought to be jungles and people that look different, not white people who live in apartment buildings. That's what Ukraine was. But the reason she asked me that was because of this, what God had said to her some time back, and she was suspecting that this was going to happen, and it did. So we went back, and we did deputation through the following year. We did deputation while I continued to teach the next year at UBC. And so I'd get home sometimes at 4 o'clock in the morning, go to the staff prayer meeting at 6 in the morning, and be in class then after that. And so we did that week after week through that year, did our deputation, and went. So all kinds of adventures. And am I supposed to quit at 3? All right, we've got 5 minutes. And but there's all kinds of exciting things. And we made a trip up into Russia. We had a gang try to break into our apartment there in Kiev, and Stephanie stood and held the door locks because they were trying to turn them from the outside. And it is all kinds of great things. Cultural differences. These pastors, they normally would greet each other with a kiss, these Ukrainian pastors, and on the mouth, okay? This is not a kiss on the cheek. This is a kiss on the mouth. The idea of getting kissed by an old whiskery guy did not appeal to me at all. And I was so glad they understood that Americans don't do that. I never did get kissed by an old whiskery pastor, and I'm glad. It would not be a memory that I would treasure. And so, I look at the way God has led and the way He opens doors. And going then when I started with Holiness Pilgrim Mission, and when I started eventually with EFM, and the way God opened the doors. And, as I look at the way He led, often He made His will known by me being aware that I was needed for something and giving me a desire to respond to that need. And sometimes it wasn't a quick thing. I had to pray about it, and others were praying about it, and I began to just feel a sense of responsibility. And I think that, and it may not be that way for everybody, I just began to feel this is something I could do, and I should. I should do this. I would not be taking my responsibility if I did not do this. And that's how the call of God came to me many times. I had COVID in Liberia and was in the hospital there for 19 days. That was a scary time. And I can't say that if God is blessing and helping you that the doors will always open easily. Some people take that as a sign of God's will. Things happen easily. Well, it never has much happened easily for me. But we do have the providential things that God does along the way. It doesn't mean things happen easily, but He does things along with your efforts, along with the trials and hard times you're having. You'll see that God did something too, and that serves as a confirmation that you're on the right track. I've known some people giving up things quickly. Well, it must not be the Lord's will because we're having such a hard time. Well, anything really worth doing, the devil's going to fight, and you'll probably have a hard time. So that's really not a sign of God's will. Well, I think our time is up. But thank you for listening to my stories, and I hope it's a help to you.